Chicago, 1893. The city glitters under the false dawn of electric light, its streets humming with the fever of the World's Fair. Crowds pour through turnstiles, dazzled by fountains, by wheels that scrape the sky, by promises that the future has finally arrived. But just beyond the white city's glow, another building rises, tall, angular, and wrong. Its windows reflect nothing. Its hallways shift like a trick of the eye. To some, it is a hotel. To others, a curiosity. Step inside, though, and the air changes. The wallpaper hums faintly with gas lines no guest can see. Doors lock with a sound too final, too absolute. A chute yawns beneath the floorboards, leading not to laundry but to silence. And in the cellar below, a furnace breathes like an iron-lunged, hungry patient. Herman Webster Mudgett, known to history as H. Holmes, smiles behind the desk, his mustache neat, his voice calm, his hands steady. Guests sign their names in ink, unaware they are writing themselves out of existence. By the time the fair closes, some will never be seen again. They called it the World's Fair Hotel. Later, they called it the Murder Castle. And more than a century on, the question is not just how many disappear within its walls, but how a whole city managed not to notice. They found the notebooks after his arrest, little scraps of leather-bound pages. The ink hurried, jagged, almost trembling, as if the hand that wrote them was racing against discovery. In one, he sketched crude blueprints, hallways leading to nowhere, doors that opened only from the outside, a chute that plunged straight into a locked cellar. On the margins, he scribbled a single phrase, repeated like a chant: "I am safe when they cannot find a way out." Imagine reading that while standing inside his labyrinth of brick and plaster. The wallpaper peels to reveal hidden seams. A mirror does not reflect a room, but masks another door. The air smells faintly of gas even when the pipes are closed. You take a step forward and the floor creaks, not because it's old, but because beneath it is a hollow space, a chamber designed to muffle screams. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H. Holmes, was not a man who killed in alleys or in fits of rage. No, he built architecture like a predator sharpens teeth. He constructed an entire building not to sell goods or house tenants, but to turn human beings into inventory. Chicago called it a hotel. History calls it something else, the Murder Castle. Holmes himself once claimed that he was born with the devil inside him. But the most terrifying thing is not that he believed it. The most terrifying thing is how meticulously he acted on it. When detectives finally forced their way into the castle, what they discovered was not chaos. It was order, a perfectly designed system for making people disappear. And here's the worst part. During the 1893 World's Fair, thousands of strangers came pouring into Chicago looking for cheap rooms and bright lights. They checked in. They never checked out. This is not the tale of a man losing his mind. This is the story of a man who never wanted to find it in the first place. Chicago, 1893. The city was a fevered dream made of steel beams and soot. Smoke poured out of the factories. The railroads screamed like restless ghosts, and the streets stank of manure and ambition. Everything was new, raw, and restless. This was the frontier of American modernity, and it was dressed up in illusions of progress. Because just a few blocks from slaughterhouses dripping with blood and alleys crawling with pickpockets, the White City rose, the world's Columbian Exposition. Imagine alabaster towers glowing with electric light, fountains shooting water higher than cathedrals, Ferris wheels spinning above the skyline. It was a promise that America wasn't just a country, it was a future. But the future was built on contradictions. The same city celebrating civilization had neighborhoods where immigrants crowded 10 to a room, where tuberculosis spread faster than gossip, where poverty turned every street corner into a gamble. And in the middle of it all, a booming demand for hotels. Visitors flooded the city. So many that opportunists set up makeshift lodgings, charging desperate fairgoers for cots in damp basements. Enter Englewood, a quieter neighborhood south of downtown, where a tall, oddly angular building rose on the corner of Wallace Avenue and 63rd Street. From the street, it looked almost respectable. Brick facade, large windows, shops on the ground floor. Nobody suspected the walls were hollow, that staircases ended in sealed walls, that some doors opened to sheer drops. From the outside, it looked like progress. From the inside, it was an anatomical theater disguised as lodging. The fair gave Holmes a stage. Think about it. A city of strangers, no one keeping track of comings and goings, young women arriving alone, eager for work or dazzled by dreams of independence. When someone vanished, who noticed? Families were hundreds of miles away. Police were overwhelmed with fairground deaths and riots. It was a city where the missing could be absorbed into the crowd like a drop of ink in water. The fair dazzled the eyes, but the streets just beyond its gates belonged to predators. Pick your metaphor. Chicago was a jewel with rot inside, a circus tent pitched over a pit, or maybe a mirror gleaming on one side, hiding darkness on the other. And in that shadow, Holmes built his castle, not because he had to, not because necessity drove him, but because the city, with all its chaos and anonymity, made it possible. The white city glowed with electricity. The castle swallowed its light whole. Before he was Holmes, he was Herman Webster Mudgett, a name that sounds more like a tax clerk than a monster. Born in New Hampshire in 1861, he came into the world in a respectable enough family. His father was strict, his mother devout, both insisting on order and discipline. The boy they raised, though, was different. Neighbors whispered he was sharp, polite, too polite, like a mask stretched too tight across something else. As a child, Mudgett supposedly had a crippling fear of skeletons. The other boys, cruel as boys are, once dragged him into a doctor's office where a human skeleton hung like a puppet of death. They shoved him close. He screamed, but later he returned on his own. He studied the bones not with terror anymore, but fascination. Fear had turned into obsession. Fast forward, medical school in Michigan. Herman was charming, brilliant even, but behind the charm was fraud. He faked insurance claims, used cadavers for profit, lied like most people breathe. He discovered something intoxicating in medicine, not healing, but how much the human body could be manipulated, altered, erased. To Holmes, flesh was clay and paperwork was camouflage. He moved to Chicago under a new name, Dr. H.H. Holmes. The doctor wasn't a lie, technically, but it was mostly a costume. And oh, how he wore it. Tall, impeccably dressed, mustache trimmed to perfection. He could walk straight out a dime novel about self-made men. Women adored him. Men admired his confidence. He exuded safety, trust, authority. And that was the cruelest trick of all. Holmes wasn't just a killer. He was a collector. He married multiple women, sometimes without divorcing the previous one, discarding them when they became inconvenient. He lured workers with promises of jobs, then refused to pay them, daring them to sue while he buried them in endless contracts. He wasn't simply violent. He was transactional. Every relationship, every smile, every handshake was an investment. But beneath the silk suits and legal papers, his ambitions were stranger. He wanted a building of his own, designed by him alone, a place where every wall and hallway obeyed his private geometry. He fired and rehired construction crews, so no one could understand the full blueprint. To outsiders, it was just eccentricity. To Holmes, it was genius. The man didn't just want to kill, he wanted to industrialize it, turn cruelty into architecture, transform human life into a ledger. His castle wasn't simply a crime scene. It was the body of H.H. Holmes himself. Polite on the surface, but hollow, shifting, Impossible to navigate once you stepped inside. It began the way horror often does, with a promise of safety. The World's Fair Hotel, as Holmes sometimes called it, opened its doors just as the Great Exposition drew thousands into the city. Travelers saw a handsome building, respectable, solid, perfect for a short stay. Young women especially were drawn to it, reassured by the soft-spoken doctor behind the desk who offered them work as typists, secretaries, or shop clerks. The first disappearances were almost invisible. A stenographer who failed to send a letter home. A fairgoer who never returned to her train. A lover who told friends she was moving in with Dr. Holmes, then vanished from memory as if she had never existed. Chicago was already a city of transients, and the fair multiplied that chaos. Missing people? The police shrugged. They'll turn up. But there were details, strange ones, that seeped out like leaks from a rotting pipe. Workmen muttered about the castle's locked rooms and Holmes's habit of dismissing them the moment a wall or corridor was finished. Neighbors noticed strange deliveries, large trunks arriving at odd hours, crates carried into the cellar and never brought out. One woman, Julia Smythe, moved in with Holmes after leaving her husband. She brought along her young daughter, Pearl. For a while, it seemed idyllic. Holmes played the doting partner, the kind employer. Then, one Christmas Eve, Julia and Pearl simply ceased to exist. Holmes's explanation was slippery. They'd gone to visit relatives, perhaps moved away. No bodies were ever found. No one ever saw them again. And still the city didn't stir. Because the fairgrounds sparkled. Because the trains kept coming. Because in a metropolis of 500,000, the vanishing of a few did not register as catastrophe. The castle itself gave whispers to anyone who looked closely. Gas jets fitted into bedrooms, pipes that led not to kitchens but into sealed chambers, a grease chute that dropped straight to the cellar, where a furnace big enough to swallow a body roared at all hours of the night. The first disturbance wasn't a single crime. It was the realization that people could disappear into this building without leaving even a ghost behind. Imagine standing outside the castle at dusk, the lights flickering on inside, knowing that once someone stepped through those doors, the odds of them walking back out were nearly zero. The nightmare had begun, but nobody yet had the language or the courage to name it. The fair ended in October of 1893, but the castle didn't sleep. It kept swallowing lives even after the Ferris wheel stopped spinning and the crowds faded. Chicago's papers had been too busy praising the White City to bother with shadows, but now rumors began to seep into the public air like smoke that refuses to stay hidden. Workers whispered that the doctor had a bad habit of losing his employees. Girls who worked in his pharmacy simply stopped showing up. Holmes would shrug, saying they'd gone back home, taken another job, or fallen ill. Convenient, always convenient. Yet no letters arrived from these women. No families heard from them again. One neighbor remembered the night strange smells drifted out from the castle's basement. Like burnt rubber, someone said. Another swore it was the smell of roasting meat. Holmes laughed it off, said the furnace was used for odd scraps, just refused. But the scent clung, thick, unforgettable, as though the building itself was trying to confess. And then came the contradictions, the details that should have been alarms. Holmes's charm was magnetic, but his lies stacked so high they threatened to topple. He juggled wives like theater roles, married one under the name Holmes, another as Mudgett, while still keeping mistresses and lovers. Each woman believed she was the only one. Each, in time, drifted into the void. Chicago's detectives did not see a criminal empire. They saw a successful businessman. After all, Holmes had a pharmacy, a hotel, investments. He spoke eloquently, dressed better than most lawyers, and never raised his voice. He didn't fit the image of a predator. He was the image of respectability, which is precisely why it could operate undisturbed. By 1894, the web began to fray. Creditors started pressing him. Lawsuits mounted. Holmes's endless cons, insurance scams, fraudulent business deals, fake property claims, caught more attention than the whisper of missing women. To the authorities, the real threat wasn't death inside the castle. It was unpaid debt. Think about that. A man could build a labyrinth of nightmare chambers, soundproof rooms, secret doors, vats of acid, and no one cared until he missed a payment. The city was more offended by fraud than by vanishing daughters. The mystery wasn't just how Holmes operated. The mystery was how no one saw him. Or maybe they saw, and they chose to look away. That's the most chilling thought of all. Maybe the castle's bricks weren't just cement and mortar. Maybe they were made of indifference. It wasn't murder that first drew the law to Holmes. It was money, Pinkerton agents, those relentless bloodhounds of the 19th century, began sniffing around after insurance companies noticed his suspiciously creative claims. A horse here, a property there. Even his own life supposedly snuffed out once or twice on paper. He was like a magician who never stopped pulling corpses from his hat, each one worth a payout. Holmes fled Chicago under a tangle of aliases, drifting from Texas to Missouri to Philadelphia. Along the way, he kept weaving new schemes, drawing new victims into his orbit. He could not stop. It was less compulsion than appetite, fraud and blood as a double diet. And yet, everywhere he went, the shadow of the castle followed him. When detectives finally forced entry into his Englewood fortress in 1895, they expected records, maybe stolen goods. What they found was beyond even the sick imagination of the penny dreadfuls. The blueprints made no sense. Endless stairways that ended at blank walls, trapdoors, seal vaults lined with asbestos, iron plates that made entire rooms airtight. There were surgical tables in the basement, quicklime pits, vats of acid, even a monstrous furnace large enough to turn bone to ash. Theories spread like wildfire. Some said Holmes had sold skeletons to medical schools, stripping flesh in his basement before shipping bones off to universities. Others whispered that he had turned his victims into chemical sludge, reducing them to nothing more than stains on the floor. And of course, there were rumors he had done both. But evidence was slippery. Bones found in the cellar were too fragmentary, too burned to match with certainty to names. Clothing scraps hinted at women long reported missing, but nothing conclusive. Families of the vanished demanded answers, but Holmes, ever the showman, gave none. He smirked in courtrooms, denied with the calmness of a man ordering tea, then in the next breath spun grandiose confessions that contradicted everything. One day, he admitted to 9 killings. Another day, to 27. Later still, to over 100. Detectives tore their hair out. Was he exaggerating for attention? Or downplaying the truth? He seemed less like a criminal testifying, and more like a novelist performing. Each number was a plot twist, each confession another chapter. And so the theories multiplied. Was the castle truly a slaughterhouse for dozens? Or had Holmes merely staged it that way to terrify and confuse? Was he a prolific killer, or a fraud who stumbled into murder by accident? Even as investigators sifted through ash and bone, the truth slipped away, elusive as smoke. What they didn't know was this: the castle was not a hotel. It was a machine that consumed the living and gave back only silence. It was supposed to be just another scam. Holmes teamed up with an associate named Benjamin Pitzel, a drifter with a taste for schemes. The plan: fake Pitzel's death, collect the insurance, and split the money. Simple, routine. But Holmes had a way of turning everything routine into horror. Instead of faking the death, Holmes actually killed him, left his body charred and unrecognizable, then calmly claimed the insurance payout as if nothing had happened. And here's where the breakdown begins, because unlike the nameless women swallowed by the castle, Pitzel had a family, a wife, children, People who asked questions, people who trusted Holmes when he offered to help them through their grief. He convinced Mrs. Pittizel that the scam was still in play, that her husband was alive and hiding, that the money would soon be theirs. He even took custody of 3 of the Pittizel children, promising to reunite them with their mother. Instead, he led them on a macabre tour of cities, Cincinnati, Detroit, Indianapolis, constantly shifting lodgings, spinning lies, never letting them settle. The children wrote letters, hopeful, believing their mother was just one train ride away. 2 of those children, Alice and Nellie, never made it home. Their small bodies were later discovered in a cellar in Toronto, buried like secrets. The youngest, Howard, was found in Indianapolis, reduced to little more than bone and ash in a stove. Holmes had crossed a line, and even the jaded Pinkertons could no longer shrug him off as a con man. He was something far worse. This was a turning point. Holmes wasn't just an eccentric fraud with a strange building. He was now the killer of children, a crime too visible, too unforgivable to be buried under paperwork or polite denial. The law tightened its grip, and for once, Holmes could not charm his way free. In court, he tried. Oh, how he tried. He smiled, he preened. He lectured the jury like a professor, explaining a lecture no one had asked for. But the cracks showed. The showman stumbled. His contradictions became absurd. His lies too tangled to follow. It wasn't the castle that doomed him. It wasn't the whispers of vanished fairgoers or the faint stench of burnt flesh. It was the children, their absence so sharp, so undeniable, that not even Holmes' silver tongue could smooth it over. The man who built a house of shifting walls had finally walked into a room he couldn't escape. The trial in Philadelphia was a spectacle. Newspapers devoured every detail, turning Holmes into a Gothic villain for a public that couldn't get enough. He represented himself at times, weaving arguments with the same oily charm that had conned investors and seduced strangers. But against a mountain of evidence, insurance fraud, the remains of children, the testimony of Mrs. Pittizel, his words rang hollow. In 1895, the jury found him guilty of Benjamin Pittizel's murder. Not fraud, not the whispers of missing women in Chicago, not the castle that still loomed, silent and inscrutable on Wallace Avenue. Just one life, one crime proven beyond doubt. For that, he was sentenced to hang. But Holmes was not finished. If he couldn't escape justice, he would at least control the story. In prison, he wrote a confession published in newspapers where he admitted to 27 murders. Days later, he recanted, claiming innocence again. Then, just as abruptly, he confessed hundreds, a number so wild it sounded less like truth in theater. That's the curse of Holmes. Every answer is poisoned with doubt. Did the castle truly claim dozens of lives, or was it a carnival funhouse of frauds and failed schemes? Its horrors exaggerated by imagination and rumor? Was he a genius of murder, or merely a liar who occasionally killed when it suited him? The bodies burned in the furnace will never tell. The missing women, Julia, Emmeline, Minnie, left no graves to visit. No final word confirmed their fates. When they finally demolished the castle years later, neighbors swore the walls wept soot and the bricks cracked as though the building itself resisted death. Even the wreckage could not explain the blueprints, the gas lines, the padded rooms. It was a monument of questions, crumbling into dust without ever giving up its secrets. Holmes himself went to gallows in May 1896. Witnesses said he stood calm, even smug, as if watching someone else's execution. The trapdoor dropped, the rope snapped tight, and yet, depending on which paper you read, his death was either swift or horribly prolonged. His neck refusing to break, his body twitching for 20 minutes. Even in dying, he refused consistency. And so the lingering questions remain. Was Holmes truly America's first great serial predator, a human spider in a web of brick and plaster? Or was he something stranger, a fraud so committed to deceit that even his confessions became performance art? The castle is gone, but the uncertainty remains, like smoke that refuses to clear. The murder castle burned in 1895, while Holmes still sat in prison awaiting the rope. Some said it was arson, a neighbor tired of living in the shadow of evil. Others whispered that the fire was orchestrated, a final attempt to erase whatever evidence might have been left inside. Flames gutted the interior, but the shell remained, hulking and grim, until it was finally torn down in the 1930s. A U.S. post office squats there now, a bureaucratic tombstone for a nightmare no one dares acknowledge in the mailroom. But Holmes himself refused to stay buried in history. The papers kept his legend alive, calling him America's master of murder, a criminal architect who could only have been born in the age of industrial capitalism. Writers compared his castle to a factory line, except the product wasn't goods, it was death. Chicago had its white city of progress, and just blocks away, Holmes built its black twin, a parody of efficiency and modern design. His story bled into folklore. He became the boogeyman of Englewood, the face of unchecked greed, the man who proved that beneath the top hat and fine suit, America's new class of businessmen might just be monsters. Later generations would point to him as the nation's first serial killer. Though the term hadn't even been coined yet, Holmes was a category before the category existed. The legend only grew. Some writers inflated his death toll into the hundreds, painting the castle as an assembly line of horror. Others doubted, trimming his victims down to a handful and arguing that the building was more myth than massacre. But maybe that's his true legacy. Not just the crimes themselves, but the fog of uncertainty he left behind. Holmes blurred fact and fiction so thoroughly that he became both man and myth, a ghost haunting America's imagination. And that fog lingers. True crime enthusiasts still argue about blueprints and body counts. Historians sift through court records and yellowing newsprint, trying to separate evidence from exaggeration. Even television and novels keep resurrecting him, turning Holmes into a kind of Gothic mascot of Chicago's darkest hour. Holmes wanted control above all else, over money, over women, over lives. In death, he still has it, because the truth of H.H. Holmes is a hall of mirrors. You walk in, searching for answers, and end up staring at endless reflections, none of them quite real, all of them terrifying. Imagine walking to the castle today, not the post office that replaced it, but the original maze of suffocating rooms, the doors that locked from the outside, the staircases that led nowhere. Would you hear echoes? Footsteps that stopped mid-stride? Or would you only hear silence, the kind that feels like it's holding something back? Holmes once said, "I was born with the devil in me." It's a quote that journalists love because it sounds like pure confession, the Gothic flourish of a man unmasking himself. But listen closer. Isn't it too neat? Too rehearsed? Almost like he was giving history the perfect headline. Holmes wasn't just killing. He was curating his legacy, deciding what version of himself would endure. And that's the trap. Because when we talk about Holmes, we don't really know if we're talking about the man or the myth he built brick by brick, lie by lie. Was he a genius of horror, a calculating industrial murderer, or just a fraud who stumbled into darkness, letting rumor inflate his cruelty into legend? The truth is locked away with the ashes, the bones, the blueprints burned long ago. But the castle remains, not in brick, but in memory. Every time someone checks into a hotel alone, every time a stranger smiles too warmly, every time we look at a building and wonder what's hidden behind its walls, Holmes teaches us that terror doesn't always arrive with a knife in the alley. Sometimes it wears a perfect suit, signs a ledger, and offers you a room for the night. The castle is gone. The man is gone, yet the unease he built still stands. And maybe that's the real architecture of H.H. Holmes. Not the bricks and mortar of Englewood, but the blueprint he left in our minds. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.